April 1945. As the waves of the Pacific crashed against the shores of Okinawa, none of the 180,000 American troops knew they were about to step into an 82-day nightmare, the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Silent beaches that hid unspeakable traps, hills transformed into killing machines, and skies darkened by thousands of suicide planes. Okinawa was not just a battle, it was a grim warning to the entire world. If an island demanded such an ocean of blood, what unimaginable price would the invasion of Japan itself require? The Pacific was deceptively calm that May morning. Aboard the massive carrier Bunker Hill, men of the U.S. Fifth Fleet stretched their legs, smoked cigarettes, and allowed themselves, if only for a moment, the fragile illusion of safety. For 58 relentless days, the carrier and her crew had supported the island-hopping advance across the Pacific, pounding targets and screening amphibious landings. Now with Okinawa looming just beyond the horizon, a brief reprieve seemed almost earned. But war has a cruel way of punishing comfort. Through the low curtain of cloud, a lookout shout tore across the deck. Zeros inbound. In an instant, the fragile calm shattered. Two Japanese planes' engines, screaming like banshees, plunged from the sky in a suicidal fury. They pierced the smoke and clouds, their silhouettes black spears against the light. The first slammed into the Bunker Hill, detonating in a deafening explosion. The second followed its bomb, crashing into the carrier's heart before the fuselage itself disintegrated in fire. Steel shrieked as if alive. Fireballs rolled down corridors, igniting fuel, ammunition, and men. The deck convulsed beneath sailors' feet, the once mighty ship twisting in agony, her metal warped by heat. Screams cut through the inferno, shouts for water, for help from mothers thousands of miles away. Some men leapt into the sea, their uniforms ablaze. Others fought with hoses and bare hands, trying to save both ship and shipmate, knowing they could be consumed at any moment. The kamikaze strike was more than an attack, it was a prophecy. The Bunker Hill's ordeal was a cruel preview of what awaited American forces on Okinawa, the largest and bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. If a single ship could be turned into a floating inferno within minutes, what horrors would an entire army face against a determined enemy willing to die to the last man? Between April 1st and June 22nd, 1945, the struggle for Okinawa would become an 82-day storm of fire and blood. It would claim tens of thousands of lives on both sides, military and civilian alike, and force the Allies to reconsider the very possibility of invading mainland Japan. The fire on the deck of the Bunker Hill was not just a disaster, it was the opening note of a dirge that would echo across the Pacific. And so, as the flames consumed steel and sailor alike, the stage was set. The calm seas of the Ryukyus would soon erupt into a cauldron of unimaginable violence. What unfolded on Okinawa was not just another battle, it was a descent into the very heart of hell. To understand why Okinawa mattered so much, one must first picture the vastness of the Pacific. Thousands of islands scattered across a blue infinity, each one fought over not for its soil but for what it represented. Airfields, anchorages, stepping stones on a deadly ladder leading toward Japan itself. By March of 1945, that ladder had already been drenched in blood. Iwo Jima had fallen only weeks before, secured at staggering cost. The Marines who raised the flag atop Mount Suribachi were celebrated as heroes, but many of their comrades lay in shallow graves carved out of volcanic ash. The lesson was burned into every soldier's mind. If an island that small could cost so much what awaited them on Okinawa, a sprawling island 60 miles long with hills, ridges, and valleys that seemed purpose-built for defense. For the Americans, Okinawa was not just another objective. It was the last, most crucial stepping stone. Barely 350 miles from Kyushu, it was close enough to serve as a launch pad for bombers to strike the Japanese home islands with merciless regularity. It offered protected anchorages for the fleet that would escort an invasion force, as well as airfields that could house fighters to guard those bombers. To take Okinawa was to hold a knife at Japan's throat. The invasion was given the code name Operation Iceberg, a fitting metaphor. Like an iceberg, Okinawa promised visible danger on the surface, but hidden beneath was a mass of unseen deadly resistance. Command fell to Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., son of a Confederate general who had once fought at Chickamauga during the American Civil War. Buckner was known as steady and pragmatic, though not without critics who felt he was unimaginative. He commanded the newly formed U.S. 10th Army, 7 battle-hardened divisions, 3 Marine and 4 Army, supported by 180,000 additional troops in combat and service roles. It was one of the largest American forces ever assembled in the Pacific. At sea, the mighty Fifth Fleet was under Admiral Raymond Spruance, a man whose calm demeanor and sharp intellect had already guided the U.S. Navy to victory at Midway and the Philippine Sea. Under his command gathered an armada unlike anything the Pacific had seen before: 265 warships, 119 amphibious assault vessels, and over 200 auxiliary craft. The ocean around Okinawa would churn with steel. On paper, the Americans had overwhelming superiority. They outnumbered the Japanese defenders, possessed air supremacy, and had an endless stream of supplies flowing across the Pacific. Yet numbers could not erase the memories of Iwo Jima or Guadalcanal or Tarawa. Everyone knew that Japanese resistance grew more fanatical the closer the Allies came to the home islands. If Okinawa was this costly, what would it mean to invade Japan itself? While American planners mapped out the invasion, their Japanese counterparts prepared for a defense unlike any other. The Japanese understood that they could not stop the Americans at the beaches, not with overwhelming naval bombardment and air cover above. Instead, they would wait. The beaches would be left eerily empty, inviting the enemy in. Then in the broken hills and limestone ridges of southern Okinawa, the Japanese would turn the island into a fortress. The man tasked with orchestrating this defense was Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of the 32nd Army. A veteran officer, Ushijima was no rash fool. He was methodical, restrained, and determined to make the Americans pay for every inch of ground. Beside him stood his fiery chief of staff, General Isamu Cho, whose fanaticism balanced Ushijima's calm. Together, they created a plan to trade space for blood. Ushijima had under his command roughly 67,000 soldiers, 9,000 naval infantry, and 24,000 Okinawan conscripts. Though vastly outnumbered, they had a weapon more powerful than numbers terrain. Southern Okinawa was a labyrinth of hills, cliffs, and caves. The Japanese dug in, carving 60 miles of tunnels through the earth, hollowing out caverns where entire regiments could hide with their guns, food, and ammunition. They would fight from underground like ghosts, emerging only to strike before disappearing again. Instead of defending the entire island, Ushijima concentrated his forces in the south near the ancient capital of Shuri. There, behind interlocking lines of fortifications, they would force the Americans into a slow, grinding battle of attrition. It was a defensive strategy designed to bleed the invader white, and the cost would not be borne by soldiers alone. Okinawa was home to nearly 400,000 civilians, farmers, fishermen, and families who had tilled its soil for centuries. But under Japanese military rule, they were given little choice. Livestock was slaughtered to prevent capture. Food was rationed to subsistence levels, and civilians were pressed into labor digging trenches, hauling supplies, even conscripted as human shields. Many were told that the Americans would commit atrocities upon landing, that suicide was preferable to surrender. The stage was set not only for a military struggle, but for a human tragedy of staggering proportions. To the American High Command, Okinawa was simply the next objective on the map. To the Japanese, it was the last shield before the sacred homeland. To the Okinawans, it was their home about to become a battlefield that would swallow soldiers and civilians alike. As March 1945 slipped into April, the American fleet drew close. Hundreds of ships assembled off the coast, their hulls bristling with guns, their decks heavy with tanks, planes, and men. The greatest armada of the Pacific War was about to strike. The sailors who gazed at the island from offshore saw only a green ribbon on the horizon dotted with villages, ridges, and fields. But beneath that surface, hidden in caves and tunnels, the Japanese waited in silence. Every ridge was a fortress, every cave an arsenal, every field a killing ground in waiting. Both sides understood the stakes. If Okinawa fell, Japan itself would lie exposed. If Okinawa held, perhaps the Americans might falter or hesitate or be broken against its ridges. For the Japanese, sacrifice was the only currency left. For the Americans, the question was not whether they would win, but how much the victory would cost. The answer, soon enough, would horrify the world. The Pacific War had become by 1945 a contest not only of armies, but of entire nations' wills. For America, that will manifested in steel oil and sheer industrial, might the machinery of war stretching from Detroit's assembly lines to San Francisco's shipyards, from Kansas wheat fields to the remote islands where soldiers and sailors waited. Now all of it converged on Okinawa. At the center of this storm stood Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., commander of the U.S. 10th Army. His name alone carried the weight of history. The son of a Confederate General, Buckner was in many ways a living bridge between America's Civil War past and its global war present. He was pragmatic, disciplined, and to his critics somewhat unimaginative. But he had a calm confidence, the kind of steady hand needed to guide 180,000 men into one of the most dangerous operations of the war. His army was a blend of experience and exhaustion. 7 battle-hardened divisions, 3 Marine, 4 Army formed its backbone. These were not green recruits. They were veterans of Tarawa, Saipan, Leyte, and Iwo Jima. They knew the smell of blood and jungle heat, the scream of incoming mortars, the sudden finality of a sniper's bullet. They carried not only weapons, but the scars of every battle they had survived. Many had left comrades behind on beaches and ridges across the Pacific, and the weight of that loss marched with them now. Above them at sea commanded an admiral whose very presence inspired confidence, Raymond Spruance, leader of the 5th Fleet. Spruance was a quiet man, almost austere in demeanor, but behind that calm exterior lay a razor-sharp mind. He had commanded at Midway, directing the battle that turned the tide of the Pacific. He had overseen victory at the Philippine Sea, where American planes tore apart the Japanese air arm in what sailors grimly nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Now he presided over the largest naval gathering of the Pacific War. The fleet itself was an iron city at sea. 265 warships of every size and class floated in disciplined formation, aircraft carriers bristling with planes, battleships that were floating fortresses, cruisers and destroyers that formed screens of firepower. Behind them steamed the lifeblood of the fleet oilers, supply ships, repair vessels without which the steel juggernaut could not move. In all, more than 500 vessels would participate in Operation Iceberg. To those who stood on Okinawa's shores and gazed out to sea, the horizon itself seemed made of metal. Yet sheer numbers did not erase the gnawing fear. These men had faced the Japanese before, and they knew what awaited them. The soldiers who had survived Iwo Jima still woke in the night to the echoes of screams. The thunder of underground charges, the suffocating smoke of flamethrowers clearing bunkers one by one. The Navy sailors remembered kamikazes plummeting out of the sky, turning sleek destroyers into flaming wreckage within seconds. No amount of ships or planes could guarantee safety when fighting an enemy who had vowed never to surrender. The preparations for Okinawa were a masterpiece of logistics. Landing craft had to be marshaled and timed tanks waterproofed for the surf supply lines, coordinated across thousands of miles of ocean. Every bullet, every ration, every gallon of gasoline had to be counted and shipped forward. The sheer scale was staggering. In the weeks leading up to the landing, American forces stockpiled 500,000 tons of supplies, mountains of ammunition, crates of medical kits, pyramids of sea rations stacked like crude monuments to industrial might. The men themselves prepared in different ways. Some sharpened their bayonets. Others wrote letters home they feared would be their last. Chaplains moved among them, offering quiet words, prayers, and sometimes just a hand on a shoulder. Marines swapped dark jokes to cover the dread in their stomachs. Soldiers traced crude maps in the dirt, memorizing landing zones and objectives. On the carriers, pilots paced the decks, checking their planes again and again, knowing they might be asked to dive into a wall of flak that very morning. And yet, amid the tension, there was also grim pride. This was not just another island. It was the final gateway to Japan. Everyone understood that their sacrifice here could shorten the war, save countless lives by bringing the fight closer to Tokyo's doorstep. The burden was crushing, but so was the conviction that history itself was watching. Spruance's fleet maneuvered toward the island like a predator closing in on prey. Reconnaissance flights buzzed overhead, photographing ridges and beaches. Submarines scouted the waters, hunting for mines and Japanese patrols. Battleships prepared their heavy guns for the bombardment that would shake the earth itself. Every piece of the machine was aligned, waiting for the signal to strike. And across the water, unseen but very real, the Japanese watched. From tunnels and ridges, scouts observed the horizon thick with American ships. They reported back to Ushijima's headquarters, where maps were spread across rough tables in candlelit caves. The reports confirmed what they already knew: the Americans had brought everything. This would not be a skirmish. It would be the battle that decided the fate of Okinawa and perhaps even Japan itself. For the Americans, the question was simple yet terrifying. Could overwhelming force crush an enemy willing to die rather than yield? Could steel and firepower overcome fanatical resistance entrenched in stone? And for every soldier and sailor, the more personal question lingered: would they see home again? As dawn crept closer to April 1st L-Day, the American war machine was ready. Carriers launched early flights, their engines roaring into the pale morning. Battleships turned their guns toward shore, their barrels like the fingers of giants pointing at the island. Amphibious craft bobbed in the waves, packed with soldiers who gripped their rifles and stared at the dark silhouette of Okinawa. The island lay waiting, silent and green, as if untouched by war. But everyone knew better. Beneath that calm surface in the caves and tunnels, the Japanese were waiting with rifles loaded, mortars sighted, and a determination as unyielding as stone. The war machine had gathered. Now it would collide with an enemy unlike any faced before. And the people of Okinawa, the farmers, the fishermen, the families caught in the middle, were about to be swallowed whole by a battle not of their choosing. The largest armada in the Pacific War stood poised to strike. The sea was no longer an ocean, it was a battlefield, waiting for its first shot. While American ships loomed off the horizon in their thunderous thousands beneath Okinawa's ridges and limestone cliffs, another army prepared in silence. These men had no illusions about the outcome of the war. They knew Japan was losing, that their navy was shattered, and their skies dominated by American bombers. But they also knew something else. They could make the enemy pay, make them bleed so badly that even victory would taste like ashes. The man orchestrating this grim plan was Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commander of Japan's 32nd Army. Ushijima was a soldier of the old school, disciplined, deliberate, and far from the reckless hotheads who had led Japan into war. His demeanor was calm, even paternal, but he was paired with a very different man, General Isamu Cho, his fiery chief of staff, a fanatic who believed in sacrifice above survival. Together, their personalities created a duality: Ushijima, the steady strategist, Cho, the firebrand, demanding that Okinawa become a pyre of resistance. The strategy was ingenious in its simplicity. They would not meet the Americans on the beaches. That had been the fatal mistake at places like Tarawa and Saipan, where defenders were annihilated by naval bombardments before the enemy even landed. No, on Okinawa, the beaches would be eerily empty. The Americans would pour ashore unopposed and for a brief moment believe themselves lucky. Then, as they pushed southward into the island's broken terrain, the true battle would begin. This strategy depended on the land itself. Southern Okinawa was a fortress carved by nature: rolling hills, steep ridges, and thick limestone cliffs riddled with caves. To Ushijima and Cho, these features were gifts from the gods of war. Their soldiers dug into the reverse slopes of hills, positions hidden from direct artillery and naval bombardment. They built concrete bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, creating kill zones where advancing troops would be funneled into the crosshairs of machine guns and mortars. And then there were the tunnels. By April 1945, Japanese engineers had carved more than 60 miles of underground passageways into the rock. These tunnels connected command posts, artillery positions, and living quarters, allowing entire battalions to vanish beneath the earth. Soldiers slept in damp, airless caverns, their rifles stacked neatly by their sides, their uniforms stiff with sweat and dust. Food, ammunition, and even hospitals were hidden below ground. In many places, the tunnels were so extensive that a Japanese unit could vanish on one side of a ridge and reappear on another, confounding American attacks. Life in these subterranean fortresses was bleak. Soldiers lived by the dim light of candles or lanterns, breathing in the stench of unwashed bodies, rotting food, and the ever-present damp of limestone. Many were teenage conscripts drafted from Okinawa itself, handed rifles and told to die for an emperor they had never seen. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs as the Japanese command had slaughtered livestock and restricted rations to preserve supplies. Sweet potatoes became the staple of survival, a poor substitute for rice, leaving stomachs hollow and spirits low. Yet discipline held. The soldiers sang military songs in the dark, wrote letters they knew might never be delivered, and swore to fight until the last bullet. In the words of one Japanese officer, "We were already ghosts before the battle began. Our task was to show the Americans that ghosts can kill." Above them, the civilians of Okinawa bore their own burden. Farmers were forced to abandon fields to dig trenches. Young boys were given bamboo spears and told they might have to repel invaders. Schoolgirls served as nurses in underground hospitals where the wounded lay in rows, groaning in feverish pain. Fear seeped into every corner of life. The Japanese military spread rumors that Americans would torture civilians, desecrate women, and burn villages. Mothers whispered to their children about the honor of suicide rather than capture. For the Okinawan people, the coming storm promised not liberation, but devastation. The Japanese defense lines were layered, each one designed to bleed the enemy before falling back to the next. The most formidable was the Shuri line, anchored around the ancient castle of Shuri, Okinawa's historic royal capital. This line bristled with reverse-slope defenses, artillery concealed in caves, and overlapping kill zones. Every hill, every ridge had a Japanese name, a code, and a plan. Every approach route had been calculated, every bunker designed to survive bombardment. To test their defenses, Ushijima's men rehearsed. Soldiers crouched in their positions, imagining waves of Americans advancing across the fields. Officers studied maps by lantern light, plotting where to direct mortar fire, how to lure tanks into ambushes, how to draw infantry into killing fields. Snipers practiced in hidden nests, waiting for the chance to pluck off enemy officers. The entire southern half of the island had been turned into a deadly labyrinth. Yet even Ushijima understood that victory was impossible. He did not delude himself with fantasies of driving the Americans back into the sea. Instead, his aim was more terrible: to buy time to inflict such horrific losses that perhaps Japan's leaders could negotiate a less humiliating peace or force the Americans to reconsider an invasion of the home islands. Each Japanese death was calculated as part of a grim equation. Every hour they held out was another hour for Japan to prepare its final defense. And so, when the American fleet appeared on the horizon, blackening the sea with steel, Ushijima did not panic. He simply ordered his men deeper into their tunnels. "Wait," he told them, "let them come." The beaches would be silent. The Americans would land in their tens of thousands, marveling at their luck. And then in the hills and ridges of southern Okinawa, the island itself would awaken as a monster. The trap was set. Long before the first American shell struck Okinawa, the island's people had already been pulled into the jaws of war. For centuries, Okinawa had been its own kingdom, a bridge between China and Japan with its own culture, language, and rhythms of life. Farmers tended terraced fields of sugarcane and sweet potatoes. Fishermen cast their nets into turquoise seas. Families gathered in wooden homes bound together by rituals, music, and a deep connection to the land. But by 1945, that land was no longer theirs. Japan had annexed Okinawa decades earlier, and now the island's people found themselves trapped between two titanic forces. To Tokyo, Okinawa was not a homeland. It was a shield, a place to be sacrificed in order to buy time for Japan itself. And so, the Japanese High Command began reshaping Okinawa into a fortress, even if it meant shattering the lives of those who lived there. The first sacrifice was food. The Japanese military ordered the slaughter of livestock across the island. Cows, pigs, chickens, animals that had sustained families for generations were taken and killed, their meat stored for soldiers, not civilians. Rice, the staple of Okinawan life, was seized. Families were told they would now live on sweet potatoes, cheap and filling, but hardly enough to keep body and spirit strong. Hunger crept into homes, and the sight of gaunt children became common. Next came labor. Men, women, even teenagers were conscripted to dig trenches, haul ammunition, and carve tunnels into the island's limestone bones. Hands that once tilled soil for harvest now blistered on shovels and pickaxes. The sound of picks striking rock echoed day and night as villagers turned into unwilling masons of their own battlefield. Then came the indoctrination. Japanese officers spread fear through rumor and propaganda. They told civilians that Americans were monsters who would rape women, butcher children, and torture men. Mothers were instructed that if capture was inevitable, they should kill their children first, then themselves, rather than endure the shame of surrender. Small pamphlets circulated among villages, teaching civilians how to commit suicide with grenades or ropes. The cruelty was not just in the physical demands, it was in the poisoning of hope itself. Entire schools were transformed into military auxiliaries. The most infamous was the Himeyuri Student Corps. 2 and 22 schoolgirls aged 15 to 19 pressed into service as nurses. They were sent to underground hospitals, dim caverns, where the wounded lay in rows, their bodies broken, their eyes glazed with fever. These girls had once studied poetry, music, and mathematics. Now they held bloody bandages, heard men scream in agony, and learned to recognize the smell of rotting flesh. For many, it was the last chapter of their young lives. In villages, families hid what little they could. A handful of rice secreted away in a cloth pouch. A chicken concealed in the brush. But discovery meant brutal punishment. Japanese soldiers beat or executed anyone accused of hoarding. And still, despite fear, mothers tried to feed their children whispering lullabies at night, as if the world outside had not collapsed into madness. The Okinawans were not blind to the irony. They had lived under Japanese rule for decades, but they were not treated as equals. Many spoke a different dialect, practiced unique traditions, and still held to a distinct identity. Yet now, in their hour of greatest need, they were told they were Japanese enough to die for the emperor. Civilians became both tools of war and victims of it. One farmer later recalled how his family was forced to abandon their home so that soldiers could dig a machine gun nest inside. The soldiers took everything: the house, the tools, even the pots used for cooking. The family huddled under a tree at night, staring at the place where their lives had once been. "We were ghosts already," he said, "alive, but not living." As the Americans prepared offshore, Okinawan civilians prepared in their own grim way. Some buried family heirlooms, hoping they might one day return. Others dug shallow shelters near their homes, holes in the ground that offered little protection from bombs. Still others, beaten down by fear, resigned themselves to the fate that the Japanese command had whispered in their ears: death was better than capture. And yet, amidst the despair, small sparks of humanity endured. Families shared scraps of food with neighbors. Mothers sang softly to soothe terrified children as the sound of bombardments began to echo in the distance. Teachers, powerless to protect their students from conscription, still tried to instill courage with quiet words of comfort. There were moments when humanity bent but did not break. The cruelty of scarcity was not only physical but psychological. Hunger gnawed at bodies, yes, but fear gnawed at minds. Civilians lived with the constant knowledge that they were expendable, that their lives, their homes, their very culture were mere obstacles in Japan's larger war. And so when American warships opened fire in late March 1945, their shells arcing like meteors across the sky, the Okinawans were already broken in spirit. The thunder of guns, the flash of explosions, the crumbling of homes, it was only the continuation of a siege that had begun months earlier. The people of Okinawa were now prisoners in their own land, caught between an enemy they had never met, and an army that demanded they die rather than live free. The island was in chains, its people bound, not with iron, but with fear, hunger, and despair. And as the earth shook with the first bombardments, they could only cling to each other. praying that somehow, someway survival might still be possible. The sea around Okinawa erupted before dawn on March 25, 1945. The American fleet stretched across the horizon like an iron wall began to roar. For 7 days, the island would endure a rain of steel, unlike anything it had ever known. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers turned their guns shoreward, and the very earth shook as shells screamed across the sky and slammed into ridges, caves, and villages. This was the prelude to Operation Iceberg, a week-long bombardment meant to soften up Okinawa before the landing. The Navy called it a preparation. To those on the island, it was the apocalypse. The noise was unrelenting. Veterans later said that the thunder of bombardment seemed less like individual shots and more like the sound of the world tearing itself apart. Entire hillsides were ripped open, sending boulders tumbling like dice. Trees were shredded to splinters. Villages that had stood for centuries vanished in seconds, reduced to rubble and dust. The American fleet had firepower beyond imagination. The battleship USS Tennessee, for instance, fired shells weighing nearly a ton each. When they struck the ground, they left craters large enough to swallow a farmhouse whole. Overhead carrier-based aircraft swooped low, strafing suspected positions with machine gun fire and rockets. The air reeked of cordite oil, and the salty tang of the sea churned by explosions. But while the destruction looked devastating, the Japanese defenders were far from broken. Ushijima's men stayed underground. The tunnels they had carved into the limestone ridges held firm, their walls shaking but not collapsing. Soldiers huddled in the dark, covering their ears, waiting for the storm to pass. Occasionally, an officer would climb to a lookout slit, peer through the smoke, and calmly mark down which positions had been hit. They emerged only after the shells stopped repairing damage, resetting guns, and preparing to face the Americans head-on when the time came. For the Americans, the bombardment was not without risk. Mines and hidden coastal guns remained a constant threat. That same week, the U.S. Navy moved to secure the Kurama Islands, a small archipelago just west of Okinawa. Though tiny, these islands were critical. They offered sheltered anchorages where damaged ships could retreat and be repaired safe from kamikaze attacks. Without them, the fleet would have nowhere to patch its wounds. On March 26th, U.S. Marines and soldiers stormed ashore on Kurama Reto. The fighting was brief but brutal. Japanese defenders fought to the last man, often refusing to surrender even when hopelessly outnumbered. In one instance, civilians fearful of the Americans due to Japanese propaganda threw themselves off cliffs rather than be captured. But within 5 days, the archipelago was secured. The Americans immediately turned it into a floating workshop, a haven where crippled ships could find temporary refuge. The bombardment of Okinawa continued with renewed fury. Every day, naval guns pounded ridges and cliffs. Every night, tracer fire stitched the sky as ships targeted anything that moved. Pilots returned from bombing runs with reports that villages had been obliterated, hills leveled, and fields scorched. Admirals on the bridge of their flagships looked through binoculars at the rising columns of smoke and nodded with grim satisfaction. Surely they thought nothing could survive this. And yet signs of the enemy persisted. Now and then, anti-aircraft fire would lance out from the smoke, forcing American planes to jink and roll. Sometimes Japanese artillery hidden in caves would open up briefly, sending shells arcing toward the fleet before vanishing again. It was as if the island itself was breathing, exhaling fury, then going silent only to inhale again. Sailors on picket duty learned the meaning of constant danger. Their destroyers stationed far from the main fleet acted as radar eyes to spot incoming kamikazes. It was the most dangerous job in the Pacific. Every man knew that the first Japanese plane spotted might very well aim straight for them. As the bombardment wore on, these destroyers endured repeated attacks. Some ships were lost. Others limped back to Kurama Reto, their decks scorched, their crews hollow-eyed. For the Japanese on Okinawa, life under bombardment was a descent into hell. Civilians who had not fled found themselves trapped in caves or shallow shelters, clutching children while the earth shook around them. Many emerged after the shelling only to find their homes reduced to smoking rubble. Their crops shredded, their wells filled with debris. Hunger, already a scourge, deepened. Families scavenged for anything edible, gnawing on raw sweet potatoes or scraps of bark. Still, the Japanese military forced civilians to labor. Men were dragged from villages to haul ammunition into tunnels even as shells fell nearby. Women and children carried water for the wounded or helped dig graves. The war had consumed every hand, no matter how young or frail. To American troops offshore, the bombardment was a spectacle both awesome and terrifying. Marines crowded the decks of landing craft, staring at the flashes along the shoreline. Some cheered at the destruction, convinced it meant an easier landing. Others felt uneasy. They had seen this before at Saipan at Iwo Jima. The beaches always looked empty after days of bombardment. Yet when the landings began, the Japanese emerged from the ground like phantoms, and the killing started. One Marine later recalled watching the bombardment of Okinawa and thinking, "We're turning that island into the moon. But I know when we step off those boats, they'll still be there waiting for us." The irony was that the Americans' overwhelming firepower, while devastating on the surface, often did little against the Japanese underground defenses. Shells cratered the land but rarely destroyed the labyrinth beneath. If anything, the bombardment hardened Japanese resolve. They knew they could withstand the storm. What they awaited was the real test, the moment when American boots touched Okinawan soil. By the end of March, the stage was set. The Kurama Islands had fallen. The bombardment had scarred Okinawa but failed to reveal its defenders. In Washington and Tokyo alike, men understood that what was about to unfold would determine the course of the war's endgame. For America, success at Okinawa would mean a direct path to Japan itself. For Japan, holding out at Okinawa might buy time to prepare for the homeland defense or to force America into negotiating. The guns of the fleet fell silent on the evening of March 31st. Smoke drifted over the island, cloaking its ridges in shadow. In the darkness, American soldiers cleaned their rifles, sharpened bayonets, and checked their packs. On the decks of landing craft, men prayed, cursed, or simply stared at the black line of land on the horizon. Somewhere in those hills unseen, Ushijima's army waited. The next morning, April 1st, L-Day, would be the moment of truth. The greatest amphibious assault of the Pacific War was about to begin. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. Across the Pacific, it was celebrated as a day of resurrection. But for the men gathered off Okinawa, it was a day of reckoning. The largest amphibious invasion of the Pacific War was about to begin. The sea itself seemed alive with ships, an armada so vast that men said you could walk from vessel to vessel without ever touching water. Battleships floated like floating fortresses, carriers with their decks bristling with aircraft destroyers knifing through waves. Around them swarmed an endless tide of landing craft, each packed with nervous soldiers clutching rifles, their helmets strapped tight, their packs heavy with gear. At dawn, the air filled with the roar of engines as waves of American planes swept overhead, strafing and bombing the shoreline. The thunder of naval guns resumed blasting the beaches with shells so massive the very earth seemed to leap skyward. It was a spectacle of fire and fury meant to break the enemy before a single American foot touched sand. And yet, when the bombardment ceased and the first landing craft surged toward the shore, something strange happened. Nothing. The ramps clattered down. Marines splashed into the surf, rifles raised. Soldiers followed their boots, sinking into wet sand. They braced for the eruption of machine guns, the shriek of mortars, the slaughter they had seen on Iwo Jima only weeks earlier. But the beaches were silent. No gunfire, no explosions, no resistance. Bacchus. Incredulous, the men advanced. Some dropped to the ground, waiting for the ambush that never came. Others sprinted forward, nerves taut as bowstrings. Minutes stretched into hours, and still the enemy did not appear. By nightfall, 60,000 Americans had landed on Okinawa with almost no opposition. Two airfields, Yontan and Kadena, fell into American hands on the very first day. The soldiers were stunned. They had expected carnage. Instead, they found runways intact, hangars abandoned, and only a scattering of destroyed Japanese planes left behind. Marines raised the stars and stripes, grinning in disbelief. Was it possible? Had the bombardment crushed the defenders so completely that the island was theirs already? Admiral Spruance and General Buckner were cautious but pleased. Reports flowed and the landings had gone better than anyone dared hope. Supplies poured ashore, vehicles rolled inland, and engineers set to work expanding the airstrips. For the moment, the Americans allowed themselves to believe they had caught the Japanese off guard. But veterans sensed something darker. The silence was not victory, it was warning. It was too easy, one Marine wrote in his diary that night. Too damn easy. We all knew it meant trouble. The Japs weren't gone, they were waiting. Northward, the Marines pushed quickly. Their advance met little resistance, and within days, they controlled most of northern Okinawa. Villages were seized, ridges climbed, and Japanese stragglers brushed aside. The men grew almost complacent, some joking that maybe the war was winding down after all. Southward, however, the army began to encounter something very different. The land changed, rolling hills gave way to steep ridges and tangled ravines. Here, the Japanese waited unseen, their guns trained on every approach. Ushijima's strategy was unfolding exactly as planned. Let the enemy come ashore unopposed, then bleed him dry in the killing grounds of southern Okinawa. Back on the beaches, the American buildup accelerated with astonishing speed. By April 3rd, over 120,000 men had landed. Supply dumps grew into small cities, stacks of crates rising like strange monuments. Tanks rolled ashore, their treads grinding against the sand. Amphibious tractors ferried artillery inland, while Seabees built roads and dugouts with mechanical precision. The sheer scale was overwhelming. Okinawan villagers peering from hiding places watched in awe as an entire industrial nation seemed to disembark onto their homeland. The shoreline bristled with tents, trucks, and guns. It was as though a new city had sprung up overnight, one forged not of stone or wood, but of steel and khaki. For American troops, the relief of an easy landing was tempered by unease. Some soldiers picked through abandoned Japanese positions and found signs of deliberate withdrawal, spent shell casings, half-buried supplies, even messages scrawled in Japanese warning of the battles to come. The defenders had not been destroyed. They had melted into the ridges, waiting for the right moment to strike. As night fell on L Day, flares arced into the sky, illuminating the beaches in eerie white light. Machine guns were set up along perimeters and soldiers dug foxholes in the sand. Many lay awake, staring into the darkness, straining to hear the first shots of the counterattack. But still, the night passed in uneasy quiet. The Americans had secured their beachhead. They'd captured airfields and established supply lines. It was on paper a triumph. Yet every man knew in his gut that the battle had not truly begun. The enemy had not vanished. He was waiting somewhere in the hills ahead, silent as the grave. The next morning, as patrols pushed south, that silence began to break. Sporadic sniper fire cracked from ridgelines. Mortar rounds thudded into advancing columns. Entire squads disappeared into hidden kill zones. And slowly, the Americans realized the truth. They had not stormed an undefended island. They had walked willingly into a trap. The silent beaches of April 1st were only the beginning. The real Okinawa waited in the south in the ridges and caves, where Ushijima's men crouched with rifles, ready their orders clear hold until death and drag the enemy into hell with them. The Americans now held Okinawa's beaches, but the island was not uniform in its character, nor would it prove uniform in its suffering. The invasion split into two distinct campaigns, the Marines pushing northward through rugged countryside, and the Army turning south into the teeth of Japan's prepared defenses. What unfolded was a tale of contrast, ease, and progress on one front, brutal attrition on the other. The northern drive. The Marines advanced rapidly. From the moment they secured Yontan and Kadena airfields, their mission was to seize the northern half of the island before Japanese forces could regroup. The terrain in this region was mountainous and heavily forested, but it lacked the elaborate fortifications Ushijima had concentrated in the south. Resistance was scattered, small bands of Japanese soldiers, local conscripts, and naval infantry left behind to delay the inevitable. By April 7th, Marines had pushed through most of the Motobu Peninsula, a jagged finger of land jutting into the East China Sea. It was here that they met their first real challenge in the North Mount Yadadaki. a natural fortress of ridges and caves. Japanese defenders numbering around 2,000 used the terrain to deadly effect, forcing the Marines into close-quarters assaults under sniper fire and mortar bursts. For nearly a week, the battle raged across steep slopes and tangled jungle. Marines recalled the strange mix of beauty and horror. Orchids clung to cliffs while machine gun fire cut through the leaves. The air smelled of blossoms and burning powder. At night, the forest glowed with tracer fire as Japanese raiding parties slipped through the trees. Yet by April 18th, Yadarake fell. The northern campaign was essentially over. Within 3 weeks of landing, the Marines controlled 2/3 of Okinawa. Their losses were real, but light compared to the battles to come. To men in the north, Okinawa seemed a strange, almost anticlimactic operation. They buried comrades, yes, but they also rested in captured villages, patrolled quiet hillsides, and even shared moments of uneasy peace with civilians emerging from hiding. One Marine wrote home, "If the whole island is like this, maybe we'll see Tokyo before Christmas." But the Marines' optimism would prove tragically misplaced, for to the south, the army was already descending into hell, the Southern Nightmare. South of the beaches stretched the heart of Ushijima's plan, a layered defense of ridges, caves, and bunkers, each designed to grind the Americans down. Unlike the north, every mile of southern Okinawa was a battlefield waiting to erupt. The first test came at a rocky spire the Americans nicknamed the Pinnacle. Rising abruptly from the ground, it was crowned with Japanese positions invisible to approaching troops. As soldiers advanced, hidden machine guns tore into them. Mortar fire rained down, shells exploding with terrifying precision. Men scrambled for cover only to find themselves trapped in interlocking kill zones. It was a grim education. The Americans had expected some resistance, but the sophistication of the Japanese defenses stunned them. Every approach had been calculated, every field of fire pre-sighted. It was as though the defenders had rehearsed the battle long before the Americans arrived. The Pinnacle eventually fell, but at steep cost, and it was only the beginning. By April 8th, U.S. troops reached the first major defensive belt, the Kakuzu Line. Here, Japanese forces had fortified limestone ridges with tunnels, bunkers, and firing positions hidden on the reverse slopes safe from artillery and naval bombardment. When the Americans attacked, they found themselves climbing exposed hillsides under relentless fire. Tanks struggled in the broken terrain, often ambushed by well-placed artillery or destroyed by mines. Infantry advancing behind them were cut down in waves. Casualties mounted at a horrifying pace. Entire platoons were shredded in minutes. Wounded men lay moaning in the mud, pinned by fire that made rescue almost impossible. Survivors described the ground as a slaughter pen, every step forward bought with blood. At night, the Japanese struck back. Under cover of darkness, they launched counterattacks with bayonets and grenades screaming their war cries as they charged into American lines. The fighting devolved into desperate hand-to-hand combat soldiers grappling in mud and blood beneath the eerie light of flares. For the army, the reality became clear: there would be no rapid advance in the south. Every ridge was a fortress, every cave concealed death, and the enemy had no intention of retreating until he was annihilated. 2 fronts, 1 war. The contrast between north and south was stark. In the north, Marines sent letters home about swift victories. In the south, soldiers wrote letters stained with mud and despair, if they wrote at all. Generals at headquarters studied maps, their fingers tracing the slow grind of progress. The northern half of Okinawa was securely in American hands, but the southern campaign stalled almost immediately. Buckner, cautious and deliberate, refused to gamble with risky maneuvers. Instead, he ordered repeated frontal assaults, hoping that firepower and persistence would eventually wear the Japanese down. His strategy worked, but only in the most brutal attritional sense. For the men on the ground, that meant advancing into killing zones day after day, knowing that survival was as much luck as skill. We weren't fighting for ground, one soldier recalled. We were fighting for survival. Every ridge took blood. Every cave took lives. The civilian tragedy. Caught between these fronts were the Okinawan civilians. In the north, some villagers cautiously emerged after the Marines passed, offering water or food, often terrified that they would be punished for showing kindness. In the south, civilians had no such respite. They lived in caves alongside soldiers used as porters' laborers or human shields. Many were killed in bombardments meant for Japanese positions. Others, desperate and starving, were caught in crossfire while fleeing their homes. For the Americans, it was disorienting. Civilians wandered into their lines, dazed and starving, clutching children. Some soldiers offered rations, while others, wary of infiltrators, turned them away at gunpoint. War blurred every line, friend or foe soldier or farmer, human or target. The calm before the storm. By mid-April, the pattern was set. The Marines held the north. The Army battered itself against the south. And yet, the Americans had only scratched the surface of Ushijima's defenses. The Shuri line, far stronger than the Kakuzu position, still loomed ahead. Behind its ridges and caves, tens of thousands of Japanese soldiers waited patient and disciplined, determined to die, but not before dragging as many enemies with them as possible. The Americans had landed unopposed on L-Day. They had advanced north in triumph. But now, in the south, they were beginning to understand what Okinawa truly was: not a stepping stone, not just an island, but a crucible. The diverging paths were about to converge again as the full fury of the Battle of Okinawa came into view. While American soldiers clawed their way across Okinawa's ridges and ravines, far out at sea, another drama was unfolding, one that would become a symbol of both Japan's desperation and the futility of its resistance. It was called Operation Ten-Go, and at its heart lay the largest battleship ever built, the Yamato. The Yamato was a leviathan of steel pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Displacing 72,000 tons, when fully loaded, she carried 9 18.1-inch guns, still the largest ever mounted on a warship. She was a floating fortress, bristling with armor so thick it was thought nothing afloat could pierce her sides. To the Japanese people, she was more than a ship. She was a national symbol, a manifestation of power and resilience, a reminder of Japan's once mighty navy. But by 1945, the age of the battleship had passed. Aircraft carriers ruled the seas, now their planes striking far beyond the reach of naval guns. The Yamato, once the pride of a fleet, was now a relic. Still, the Japanese High Command could not let her sit idle while Okinawa burned. If the Americans were to be stopped, or at least delayed, the Yamato would be thrown into the fire. The plan was audacious and suicidal. The Yamato Sato, accompanied by the cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers, would sail from the Japanese homeland with barely enough fuel for a one-way trip. They would dash toward Okinawa Beach themselves in shallow waters and turn their guns against the invading American fleet and troops ashore. It was a mission of sacrifice, a maritime kamikaze attack writ large. Few of the sailors expected to return. On April 6, 1945, the task force slipped out of Tokuyama Bay, heading south through the Seto Inland Sea. Sailors stood on deck, staring back at the fading Japanese coast, some weeping, others stoic. They knew they were embarking on a voyage of no return. Letters were written hastily, folded into pockets, and trusted to comrades. Officers spoke of duty and honor, though beneath their words lay an unspoken truth: they were sailing to their deaths. The Americans, however, were not blind. Codebreakers had already intercepted messages about the sortie. Submarines and reconnaissance planes tracked the Japanese task force almost as soon as it left port. Admiral Spruance prepared his response, not a fleet engagement, but a storm of carrier aircraft that would descend upon the Yamato before she ever reached Okinawa. On April 7th, as the Japanese ships plowed south through gray seas, the sky suddenly filled with specks American aircraft, hundreds of them. Dive bombers, torpedo planes, fighters, all converging on the doomed flotilla. The Yamato's gunners sprang into action, their anti-aircraft cannons blazing, filling the sky with black puffs of smoke. Pilots later recalled the scene as a storm of flak, a forest of fire rising from the battleship's decks. But the Americans pressed in. Torpedo bombers skimmed the waves, lining up their runs, while dive bombers screamed down from above. Explosions tore into the Yamato, one after another. Torpedoes slammed into her hull, sending fountains of water higher than her masts. Bombs punched through her decks, igniting fires. Her great guns, designed to duel other battleships, thundered uselessly at fleeting targets in the sky. Sailors aboard the Yamato fought with desperate courage. They carried shells to anti-aircraft guns with bare hands, dragged wounded comrades across burning steel, and kept firing even as flames spread. Yet the onslaught was overwhelming. Wave after wave of American planes attacked with relentless precision like predators circling a wounded giant. After hours of punishment, the Yamato was mortally wounded. Her hull listed heavily water rushing into her breached compartments. Fires raged uncontrollably. Ammunition magazines threatened to explode. Captain Kosaku Ariga, refusing to abandon ship, ordered his crew to fight to the end. Many sailors tied themselves to their stations, vowing not to leave their posts alive. At 2:23 p.m., the end came. The Yamato capsized to port, her massive bulk rolling over in the water. For a moment, she lay on her side, her great guns pointing helplessly at the sea. Then, with a thunderous roar, her magazines detonated. The explosion was so massive, it sent a mushroom cloud 6 kilometers into the sky, visible for miles around. The sea boiled with fire and oil as debris rained down. The pride of the Imperial Navy was gone. Of the Yamato's crew of over 300 men, fewer than 300 survived. The cruiser Yahagi and 4 destroyers were also sunk. The rest limped home, battered and burning. Operation Ten-Go had ended in catastrophe before the Japanese fleet ever came within striking distance of Okinawa. For Japan, the loss of the Yamato was more than military. It was spiritual. She had embodied the nation's naval glory, the idea that sheer strength and resolve could defy any enemy. Now she lay at the bottom of the sea, destroyed, not in a duel with another battleship, but by swarms of aircraft. Her death marked the twilight of an era, the final confirmation that air power now ruled the seas. To American sailors and airmen, the destruction of the Yamato was a triumph, but also a sobering reminder of Japan's desperation. They had watched kamikazes hurl themselves at carriers and destroyers. Now they had witnessed an entire battleship sent on a suicide mission. If Japan was willing to sacrifice even its greatest symbols, what horrors awaited on the beaches of the home islands? One American pilot circling over the explosion later reflected, "It wasn't just a ship going down, it was an empire." Back on Okinawa, news of the Yamato's destruction spread quickly. To the soldiers entrenched in the south, it was both a tragedy and a confirmation of their fate. There would be no rescue from the sea, no great fleet to sweep the Americans away. They were alone, bound to the earth beneath their feet. Their task was now clear: to fight to bleed and to die, taking as many of the enemy with them as possible. The sea had burned. The pride of Japan was gone. And on Okinawa, the real battle was only just beginning. The Americans advancing southward soon learned that the silence of L-Day had been nothing but a cruel invitation into a killing ground. On April 8, 1945, the U.S. 10th Army collided with the first great barrier of the Japanese defense, the Kakuzu Line. What followed was a descent into a maelstrom of fire, mud, and death that shattered any illusions of an easy victory. The approach to Kakuzu, the countryside of southern Okinawa, was deceptive in its beauty. Rolling fields of sugarcane swayed in the wind, villages dotted the valleys, and limestone ridges rose like natural walls across the horizon. To the untrained eye, it seemed peaceful. To the American soldiers advancing cautiously through the fields, it felt like walking into a painting where every brushstroke concealed a rifle barrel. The Japanese had transformed the Kakuzu ridgeline into a fortress. Tunnels honeycombed the limestone, allowing defenders to vanish underground and reappear at will. Machine guns were sighted on reverse slopes, invisible until they opened fire. Mortars had been pre-sighted on every likely approach, ready to rain steel the moment Americans exposed themselves. It was a defense crafted with cold calculation, and it was waiting. The first assault. On April 8th, American troops of the 96th Infantry Division launched their first assaults. They moved forward under the thunder of artillery support, confident that the bombardment had suppressed the enemy. But as they crested the ridges and advanced into the open, the Japanese sprang their trap. Machine gun fire erupted from hidden positions, cutting down men in swathes. Mortar shells exploded with terrifying precision, each blast tearing apart squads caught in the open. Tanks that rumbled forward for support found themselves ambushed by concealed anti-tank guns, their armor pierced by shells from point-blank range. Entire companies were stopped cold. Soldiers hugged the earth pinned by fire so intense that even lifting a helmet risked death. The battlefield became a place of sudden annihilation, men advancing one moment, gone the next in a burst of smoke and flame. By nightfall, the Americans had gained nothing. The ridges remained firmly in Japanese hands, and the fields before them were littered with their dead. The reverse slope advantage. The Americans quickly discovered the genius of the Japanese reverse slope tactic. Naval and artillery bombardments had blasted the front of the ridges into rubble, but the defenders were not there. They waited just beyond the crest, sheltered from the bombardment, emerging only after the shelling ended. To dislodge them, Americans had to climb the slopes under fire, exposing themselves at every step. Soldiers spoke bitterly of charging hills again and again, only to be hurled back by the same unseen guns. One recalled, "You never saw them until they killed you. The hill itself was the enemy." A landscape of death. The fighting at Kakuzu was more than a clash of armies. It was a transformation of the land itself. Villages were obliterated by shell fire, their houses reduced to piles of charred wood. Fields that once grew sweet potatoes became open killing grounds. Caves that had sheltered farmers for centuries now belched machine gun fire. The earth was torn open, pocked with craters soaked in blood. For the Okinawan civilians trapped in this inferno, survival was nearly impossible. Many hid in caves alongside Japanese soldiers enduring the same bombardments. Children whimpered in the dark as artillery thundered overhead. Some civilians, terrified and desperate, tried to flee across the battlefield only to be caught in crossfire. Others were forced by Japanese troops to carry ammunition forward their lives, treated as expendable as bullets. American adaptation. Despite horrific losses, the Americans began adapting. Artillery was concentrated to pound suspected strong points before infantry advanced. Flamethrower teams were brought forward their task to burn defenders out of caves one by one. Engineers with satchel charges followed blasting entrances shut when flames failed. It was grueling, methodical work. Advance a few yards, clear a bunker, take cover, then repeat. Small unit tactics became essential. Large assaults only created targets for Japanese guns, so squads and platoons probed carefully, slipping through gaps, trying to flank hidden positions. It was fighting at its most intimate and savage, men crawling on their bellies through mud-lobbing grenades into dark holes, waiting for the scream of an enemy or the silence that meant death. Even so, progress was measured in feet, not miles. Every hill cost blood. Every cave devoured lives. Night fighting. At night, the battlefield became even more terrifying. The Japanese launched sudden counterattacks, slipping through the darkness to strike American lines. Soldiers were jolted awake by screams and gunfire, fumbling for rifles as bayonet charges erupted in their foxholes. Flares hissed overhead, casting the world in ghostly white light. In that eerie glow, men grappled hand-to-hand, shadows locked in mortal struggle. The nights were filled with fear and exhaustion. Sleep came only in snatches, interrupted by sudden explosions or the whispered knowledge that death could arrive at any moment. The toll. By mid-April, the cost of the Kakuzu fighting was staggering. The 62nd Japanese Division holding the line had been battered but not broken. American divisions reported hundreds of dead and thousands wounded, yet the ridges still held. One American officer wrote in frustration, "We have the firepower of the gods, yet the ground does not move. It swallows our shells, it swallows our men, and still it remains." For Japanese soldiers, the toll was equally severe. They lived in filth and darkness, their rations dwindling, their wounded groaning in underground hospitals where medicine was scarce. Yet their orders were clear: fight to the death. Many accepted that they would never see home again. They wrote farewell notes, sharpened their bayonets, and waited for the next assault. The maelstrom intensifies. As April wore on, the battle for Kakuzu became a nightmare without end. Rain began to fall, turning the ground to mud. Wounded men lay half-submerged in filthy water, crying out for medics who risked their lives with every step. Stretcher bearers slogged through muck, slipping and falling their burdens, sometimes drowned in the mire before reaching aid stations. The smell was overwhelming: gunpowder, blood smoke, and the sickly sweetness of death. Bodies lay unburied, decomposing in the heat, swarmed by flies. Soldiers stuffed cigarettes into their mouths just to block the stench. And yet, amid the horror acts of courage shown, medics dashed into fire to drag wounded comrades to safety. Infantrymen volunteered to crawl forward with satchel charges, knowing they might never return. Tank crews pressed ahead despite burning vehicles around them, determined to crack open the defenses. These moments of bravery were fleeting, but they kept the machine of war grinding forward. Stalemate. By the third week of April, the Americans had made only minimal gains. The Kakuzu line still stood, though battered, its defenders clinging stubbornly to the ridges. The battle had become a stalemate of attrition, each side locked in a struggle where survival itself felt like victory. For the men in the mud, there was no sense of strategy or grand purpose, only the daily grind of attack, counterattack, and survival. One soldier captured it best when he muttered to a reporter, "This isn't war anymore, it's slaughter." And yet, even as the Americans bled at Kakuzu, they knew this was only the beginning. Ahead lay the Shuri line, even stronger, even more formidable. The maelstrom of Kakuzu was a cruel initiation into the true horror of Okinawa. Amid the slaughter at Okinawa, where men vanished into mud and smoke as quickly as raindrops into the sea, stories of individual courage pierced the darkness like sudden flares. Among them, none shone brighter than that of a quiet, wiry medic named Desmond Doss. A man of paradox, Doss was an unlikely soldier. A Seventh-day Adventist from Virginia, he refused to carry a weapon. To many of his comrades, this seemed madness. War was not a place for pacifists. Yet Doss insisted he would serve, but not by taking life. His weapon would be faith, his mission to save rather than to kill. Some mocked him, calling him a coward. Others shunned him outright, unwilling to trust a man who entered battle without a rifle. But on Okinawa, where death ruled every ridge and valley, Desmond Doss would prove them all wrong. The climb to Hacksaw Ridge. The battlefield that immortalized Doss lay on the Maida Escarpment, a jagged cliff. The soldiers nicknamed Hacksaw Ridge. Rising nearly 400 feet, its sheer face had to be scaled by rope ladders under enemy fire. Beyond the cliff stretched a plateau honeycombed with Japanese tunnels and machine gun nests. Every approach was covered by interlocking fields of fire. To assault Hacksaw was to climb into the jaws of death. On April 29th, the 77th Infantry Division began its assault. As soldiers scrambled up the ropes, Japanese defenders opened fire, cutting men down before they even reached the top. Those who crested the escarpment found themselves in a killing field, machine guns raking the ground, mortars bursting all around. The advance stalled. Men fell back, sliding down ropes slick with blood. Others clung to the top, fighting desperately just to survive. It was here that Desmond Doss, unarmed, moved forward into the fire, a different kind of warrior. Where others carried rifles, Doss carried a medic's bag and his unshakable faith. As soldiers fell screaming, he ran to them, dragging them to cover binding wounds under fire. Bullets snapped past mortars, exploded nearby, but Doss seemed untouchable, driven by something beyond fear. When the order came to retreat, the Americans pulled back down the escarpment, leaving the wounded stranded atop the ridge. For most, it was unthinkable to return. For Doss, it was unthinkable to leave them behind. Alone, he remained on Hacksaw Ridge as night fell, listening for cries in the darkness. One by one, he found the wounded men torn by shrapnel, blinded, burned, unable to move. With quiet strength, he dragged them to the cliff's edge, tied them to ropes, and lowered them down to safety. Each time he prayed aloud, "Lord, please help me get one more." He worked through this night, exhausted, dehydrated, bleeding from his own wounds, but he never stopped. By dawn, he had saved dozens. Some estimates say 75 men owed their lives to him. His comrades who once doubted him now looked at him with awe. They called him a miracle worker, a man who had walked through hell with nothing but faith and come back carrying the wounded on his shoulders. The cost of courage. Doss's actions were not without price. In later fighting, he was wounded by shrapnel, then struck by a sniper's bullet that shattered his arm. Refusing to be carried by medics, he made them take another wounded soldier first. He crawled broken and bleeding until he too was finally evacuated. For his courage, Desmond Doss became the first conscientious objector to receive the Medal of Honor. His story would echo for decades, a reminder that heroism takes many forms. In a war defined by destruction, Doss's defiance of violence made him an unlikely legend. Medics in the Inferno. Yet Doss was not alone in his sacrifice. Across Okinawa, countless medics fought their own private wars against death. Armed only with red crosses on their helmets and canvas pouches filled with morphine and bandages, they crawled into firestorms to reach the fallen. They dragged men through mud, shielded them with their own bodies, and often died with hands still pressed to wounds they could not stop. One medic described his task with grim simplicity: "I couldn't fight. All I could do was try to keep a man alive long enough to say goodbye." The role of medics was brutal, not only physically, but emotionally. They heard the last words of countless dying men, messages meant for wives, mothers, children. They carried the weight of voices silenced forever, a burden that haunted many long after the war. The symbol of Hacksaw Ridge. Hacksaw Ridge was eventually taken, but at appalling cost. American bodies lay scattered across its plateau, while Japanese defenders fought to the last man inside their caves. For the soldiers who survived, the escarpment became more than just ground won. It was a symbol of the battle's essence: brutal, relentless, unforgiving, and yet also capable of producing acts of astonishing humanity. In later years, when the story of Okinawa was told, Hacksaw Ridge stood out. It was where faith and courage triumphed against impossible odds. It was where the horror of war revealed both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human compassion. For Desmond Doss, the memory never left. He lived quietly after the war, bearing the scars of his service, never seeking fame. When asked about his actions, he simply said, "I couldn't just stand by while my friends needed me." On a battlefield where tens of thousands perished, one man's refusal to carry a weapon and his insistence on saving life rather than taking it became a beacon. Hacksaw Ridge was not just a place on a map. It was a testament to the power of conviction in the face of unimaginable carnage. The wider cost of courage. Doss's story extraordinary, as it was pointed to a broader truth about Okinawa. The battle demanded courage from every man, whether charging a ridge, manning a machine gun, or simply enduring the daily terror of bombardment. Courage took many forms: the soldier who carried a wounded friend despite fire, the officer who led from the front, the sailor who braved kamikazes to keep his ship afloat. Yet courage also had its limits. For every man saved by a medic's hands, many more died where they fell. The battlefield consumed bravery as quickly as it produced it. The price of Hacksaw Ridge, like the price of Okinawa itself, was measured not just in victories won, but in lives extinguished. By May 1945, the Americans had taken the escarpment and other positions along the Kakuzu line, but the Japanese had merely fallen back to their stronger fortifications at Shuri. Ahead lay even bloodier battles, even more grinding attrition. The courage of men like Desmond Doss could inspire, but it could not alter the relentless mathematics of Okinawa. Every yard forward would cost blood, and every victory would be drowned in sorrow. The Americans had seen courage on Hacksaw Ridge. Now they would need it again and again as the storm of Okinawa only grew darker. By early May 1945, the battle for Okinawa had already claimed thousands of lives, yet the worst was still to come. The Americans had clawed their way through the Kakuzu defenses and seized positions like Hacksaw Ridge at a terrible price. But instead of retreating deeper into the island, the Japanese made a startling decision. General Mitsuru Ushijima, usually calm and deliberate, approved his fiery chief of staff Isamu Cho's demand for an all-out counterattack. The aim was audacious, almost suicidal strike with everything they had, throw the Americans off balance, and perhaps even drive them back into the sea. For the Japanese, this was not just a military gamble. It was an act of desperation, an attempt to shatter American momentum and show that Okinawa would not fall easily. The plan. On the night of May 4th, the 32nd Army hurled itself into the offensive. Infantry poured out of tunnels, their bayonets gleaming in the moonlight. Artillery that had remained hidden for weeks suddenly opened fire, belching smoke and flame from caves. Mortar shells rained down in furious barrages. Entire regiments surged forward, screaming their war cries as they charged into American lines. For once, the Japanese did not wait passively in their fortifications. They attacked across open ground into the teeth of American firepower. Their hope was to overwhelm through shock and ferocity to create chaos in the American front before reinforcements could stabilize it. The battle erupts. The night sky lit up as tracers and flares turned the battlefield into a ghostly stage. American machine guns rattled without pause, mowing down ranks of charging soldiers. Artillery batteries responded with devastating barrages, their shells bursting in waves across advancing columns. And yet the Japanese kept coming. They surged across ravines, through fields churned to mud around burning wreckage of tanks and trucks. Some broke into American positions, bayonets flashing in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Others slipped behind lines in small raiding parties, throwing grenades into foxholes, sowing terror in the dark. American soldiers jolted awake in their dugouts, fought with frantic desperation. Riflemen fired until barrels overheated. Flamethrowers lit the night with arcs of fire. Tanks turned their guns point blank against onrushing waves. The battlefield became a scene of chaos where friend and foe clashed at arm's length, shadows locked in mortal struggle. The futility of fire. For all their bravery, the Japanese offensive was doomed from the start. They were charging against an enemy with overwhelming superiority in firepower. American artillery was weighting its guns pre-sighted on likely approach routes. Naval bombardment joined in battleships offshore, turning their massive cannons inland, shaking the earth with each thunderous salvo. Japanese infantry melted under the storm, cut down in swathes. Entire battalions were annihilated before reaching their objectives. Yet still they fought, driven by orders, by duty, by a grim determination to die as soldiers of the Emperor. By dawn, the battlefield was littered with their bodies. Ravines were choked with corpses. The air reeked of smoke blood and the acrid tang of burned flesh. The offensive had gained almost nothing, yet it had cost the Japanese dearly. The toll. In a single night, the 32nd Army lost an estimated 7,000 men. Worse still, many of their precious artillery pieces, once carefully hidden in caves, had been dragged out to support the attack. These guns, exposed for the first time, became easy targets for American counter-battery fire. One by one, they were destroyed, leaving the Japanese with fewer resources to resist the grinding assaults that would follow. American casualties were significant, but nowhere near as catastrophic. Units shaken by the ferocity of the attack quickly regrouped, aided by their massive logistical backbone. Within days, fresh troops, ammunition, and supplies replaced what had been lost. For the Japanese, there were no such reinforcements. Every soldier killed, every gun destroyed, was irreplaceable. Ushijima's regret. When reports of the losses reached General Ushijima, he was grim. Unlike his chief of staff Cho, who had pushed for the offensive, Ushijima had doubts from the beginning. He had preferred to remain defensive to bleed the Americans slowly from fortified positions. The counterattack had been Cho's vision of glory, but it had turned into catastrophe. Still, Ushijima did not punish his subordinates. He simply absorbed the disaster with quiet dignity, ordering his men back into the tunnels and caves. The lesson was clear: there would be no more grand offensives. From this point on, the defense of Okinawa would be attrition to the bitter end. American response. With the Japanese attack shattered, General Buckner ordered the 10th Army to resume its offensive on May 11th. This time, the Americans advanced methodically, supported by crushing artillery and air power. Progress was slow, measured in yards rather than miles, but it was steady. Every Japanese position was blasted before being stormed by infantry. Every cave was sealed with satchel charges or fire. The battlefield became a grotesque rhythm bombardment, assault-resistant slaughter. Then repeat. American units rotated in and out of the line, but the Japanese had no such luxury. They remained underground, starving, exhausted, yet still fighting with fanatical determination. Reign of misery. On May 22nd, as if the carnage were not enough, the skies opened. Heavy rains poured over Okinawa, turning the battlefield into a swamp of mud and misery. Foxholes flooded, leaving soldiers shivering waist-deep in water. Trucks and tanks bogged down in mire. Wounded men lay half-drowned in the muck, their cries muffled by the downpour. Rain mixed with blood, turning valleys into rivers of red. Corpses floated in flooded ditches unburied, as the living struggled simply to endure. Soldiers joked grimly that they were fighting not just the Japanese, but the island itself. Okinawa seemed determined to consume everyone, American, Japanese, and civilian alike. The meaning of the offensive. In hindsight, the May offensive was a turning point. By abandoning their defensive strategy for one night of reckless aggression, the Japanese had squandered precious lives and weapons. From then on, they could only fall back slowly and inevitably before the American advance. Yet the offensive also revealed something deeper, the sheer desperation of Japan in 1945. Soldiers were ordered to throw themselves against impossible odds to die in waves that achieved nothing. The offensive was not meant to win. It was meant to show the world and the Americans that Japan would never surrender easily. For the Americans who survived the night of May 4th, the memory remained seared into their minds. They had seen the face of an enemy who would rather die than yield, and they understood what that meant. Okinawa would not end quickly. Every ridge, every cave, every yard of ground would demand blood. The Japanese had struck back with all their might. Now the Americans would press forward with all of theirs. The storm was far from over. While the land battle raged in mud and blood, the seas around Okinawa became a different kind of nightmare. The Japanese had unleashed their most fearsome and desperate weapon, the kamikaze. These divine wind pilots turned the sky itself into a battlefield, diving their planes into American ships with the singular intent of dying in flames. The Americans had known of kamikazes before at Leyte Gulf at Luzon, but at Okinawa, the scale was unprecedented. Between April and June 1945, nearly 900 kamikaze aircraft hurled themselves at the Allied fleet. It was the largest and most sustained suicide campaign of the war, and for sailors stationed on picket duty, it was a daily sentence of terror. The concept of the divine wind, the kamikaze strategy, was born of desperation. Japan's air force, once formidable, had been shattered. Fuel was scarce, trained pilots scarcer still, but there were still planes many outdated and barely airworthy, and there were still young men indoctrinated with the belief that to die for the emperor was the highest honor. Kamikaze pilots were often barely trained. Some had flown only a handful of hours before being sent on their final mission. They were shown maps of target ships, given a cup of sake, sometimes even a ceremonial headband, and then sent into the sky. Few expected to return. They wrote farewell letters, posed for photographs, and climbed into cockpits knowing they were already dead. The Japanese command hoped that by sacrificing themselves, these men could inflict disproportionate damage, sinking warships, slowing the invasion, and sapping American morale. If every kamikaze could take even one ship, perhaps the Americans would hesitate before attempting to invade the home islands. The radar pickets. The brunt of these attacks fell on the destroyers stationed as radar pickets. Their job was to sit far out from the main fleet, scanning the skies for incoming planes. In practice, this meant they were the first to face kamikaze swarms with little protection. Sailors grimly called it picket duty, but knew it was something closer to a death sentence. When the alarm sounded, bogies inbound, every man rushed to battle stations. Guns roared, filling the sky with bursts of flak. Fighters scrambled from carriers to intercept the attackers. Yet always, some kamikazes slipped through. They came screaming down out of the sun engines, howling wings flashing in the light. The moment of impact was apocalyptic fireballs, twisted steelmen thrown into the sea oil burning on the waves. One destroyer after another was struck. Some survived their crews, fighting the flames with desperate heroism. Others exploded, instantly sinking within minutes, dragging hundreds of sailors down. By battle's end, 26 American ships were sunk, 164 damaged, and nearly 5,000 sailors killed. Bunker Hill and Enterprise. Even the mightiest ships were not immune. On May 11th, 2 kamikazes struck the carrier Bunker Hill. The first dropped a 550-pound bomb before crashing into the flight deck. The second followed seconds later, igniting planes fueled and armed for launch. Within minutes, the carrier became a floating inferno. Flames roared across the deck, ammunition detonated in chain reactions, and men hurled themselves overboard to escape the heat. Nearly 700 sailors were killed or wounded. The Bunker Hill, though not sunk, was knocked out of the war. 3 days later, the carrier Enterprise, the Big E veteran of almost every major Pacific battle, was struck by a kamikaze. Though she survived, the damage forced her to withdraw. It was a bitter blow for a ship so revered by her crew. The psychology of kamikaze. For American sailors, the kamikaze was unlike any threat they had faced. Conventional attacks could be predicted, defended against. But how do you stop an enemy who has no intention of surviving? Even when aflame with wings torn and engines sputtering, kamikaze. Pilots often guided their dying planes into ships. There was no margin of error, no safety in crippling a plane. It would keep coming until it hit. The terror was constant. Every radar blip, every shadow on the horizon, every drone of engines overhead might be another death dive. Sailors lived in a state of perpetual readiness, nerves stretched thin. They joked darkly that the only time they felt safe was when they were already hit, because at least then it couldn't happen again. The pilot's perspective. For the kamikaze pilots themselves, the story was more complex. Some were true believers, eager to sacrifice themselves for emperor and country. Others were reluctant, coerced by social pressure or command. Many were teenagers, barely old enough to shave, their farewell letters filled with longing for families they would never see again. One pilot wrote, "Mother, forgive me for dying before you, but know that my death will protect Japan." Another scrawled simply, "I am afraid." These men were not faceless demons, but young lives consumed by a war already lost. The storm at sea. The scale of the Kamikaze campaign at Okinawa was staggering. Waves of hundreds attacked at once, overwhelming defenses. American sailors spoke of the sky looking alive with falling stars, each one a burning plane plummeting to kill. Entire days passed in continuous battleships, maneuvering frantically, guns blazing until barrels overheated. The Navy devised countermeasures. The big blue blanket of constant air patrols sought to intercept kamikazes before they reached the fleet. Pickets were reinforced. Firefighting drills became second nature, sailors ready to battle flames at a moment's notice. And still, the attacks came. By June, the sea around Okinawa was a graveyard of twisted steel. Destroyers lay at the bottom, their crews entombed within. Survivors floated in oil-slick waters, clinging to life as their rescuers scanned the skies for the next diving plane. The Americans had won the skies strategically, but tactically, they paid a terrible price. The meaning of the storm. For Japan, the kamikaze storm was both a symbol of devotion and an admission of defeat. The empire could no longer fight conventionally. It had resorted to turning young men into human bombs. For America, the storm was a grim warning. If Okinawa had demanded nearly 2,000 suicide planes, what would an invasion of Japan itself bring? 10. The cost seemed unimaginable. For the men who lived through it, the memory never faded. One sailor remembered watching a kamikaze slam into a nearby destroyer, the explosion lighting the sea. "I saw men on fire running across the deck. I heard the screams. That sound has never left me." The kamikazes had not stopped the invasion. Okinawa remained in American hands, but they had left scars on every man who faced them, and their sacrifice, however tragic, deepened the resolve of both nations. The Japanese to resist to the bitter end, the Americans to end the war at almost any cost. The sky had become a weapon. The storm at sea was a preview of what awaited if the war continued, and as the battleground on both sides knew, the price was still rising. By late May 1945, the battle for Okinawa had turned into a nightmare of attrition. The Americans had been fighting for nearly 2 months, and their advance southward slowed to a crawl. Ahead loomed the heart of the Japanese defenses, the Shuri Line, a fortress system stretching across the island near Okinawa's ancient royal capital, Shuri Castle. It was the culmination of Ushijima's defensive strategy, and it was designed to bleed the Americans white. The Shuri Fortress. The Shuri Line was not a single trench or wall, but a network of interlocking fortifications, hills, ridges, caves, and bunkers that reinforced one another. At its center rose Shuri Castle, a centuries-old Ryukyuan fortress, now hollowed out and reinforced with concrete transformed into a command post. Around it, the Japanese had dug into positions that seemed almost invulnerable. Reverse slopes shielded them from bombardment tunnels, allowed them to move unseen, and artillery hidden in caves covered every approach. The 32nd Army knew they could not hold forever. But their orders were not to hold forever. They were to inflict the maximum possible cost before retreating. For weeks, the Americans battered themselves against the Shuri defenses, and the ground drank deeply of blood. The monsoon arrives. As if the enemy were not enough, nature itself turned against the invaders. On May 22nd, the skies opened, unleashing the Okinawan monsoon. Torrential rain poured without pause, turning the battlefield into a swamp. Foxholes flooded, leaving men waist-deep in stagnant water. Artillery pieces bogged down trucks sank to their axles, tanks churned helplessly in the muck. The rain carried more than mud. It washed down the slopes, mingling with blood with the bodies of the fallen, with refuse and waste, creating rivers of filth. Soldiers described the stench as unbearable gunpowder rot, human decay, and the sweet, sickly smell of death. Men tried to sleep sitting upright, their boots submerged, their ponchos useless against the deluge. Rifles rusted in hands that could not keep them dry. Rations spoiled. Cigarettes turned to mush. The Americans had overwhelming firepower, but now it seemed even the weather conspired to nullify it. One soldier wrote in his diary, "We live like animals. The rain is constant, the mud is endless, and death is everywhere." Grinding forward. Despite the misery, the Americans pressed on. Artillery and aircraft pounded Shuri's ridges day and night. Infantry advanced yard by yard, clearing caves with flamethrowers and satchel charges. The Japanese resisted fiercely, but the continuous bombardment wore them down. Casualties mounted on both sides, the line between victory and survival blurring with each day. Every hill became a battle unto itself. Names like Conical Hill, Sugarloaf, and Half Moon became synonymous with horror. Sugarloaf in particular, a small rise near Naha, saw Marines of the 6th Division attack again and again, suffering thousands of casualties before finally seizing it. Soldiers later said it was the most terrifying position they had ever faced, machine guns firing from 3 directions, mortars raining incessantly, and defenders who refused to yield. The Americans eventually cracked each strong point, but at staggering cost. The Shuri line did not break. It was carved apart piece by bloody piece. The Japanese withdrawal. By late May, Ushijima knew the Shuri line could no longer hold. His forces were exhausted, reduced to fragments of their original strength. Ammunition was low, food scarcer still. Soldiers were starving, wounded, lay untreated in tunnels, and the once formidable 32nd Army was crumbling. On May 24th, Ushijima made the decision to withdraw southward to the Kian Peninsula, hoping to prolong the fight. The retreat was executed in stages under cover of night and rain. Units slipped away from their positions, silently leaving behind rear guards to stall the Americans. It was a disciplined withdrawal, but a costly one. U.S. forces harassed the retreat, inflicting heavy casualties. By the time the Japanese reached Kayan, they had lost tens of thousands of men. The fall of Shuri. When American troops finally reached Shuri Castle on May 29th, they found it abandoned. The fortress that had cost so much blood was eerily silent. Its defenders vanished into the southern hills. Soldiers raised the stars and stripes over its ruins, a symbolic victory. But for many, it felt hollow. The enemy had not been destroyed, only displaced. The battle was far from over. The castle itself bore the scars of endless bombardment. Its once proud walls were shattered, its halls gutted by fire. For centuries, it had been the seat of Okinawan kings, a symbol of culture and identity. Now it was rubble, a casualty of a war it had never asked to host. Okinawan civilians watching from afar wept at the loss. For them, the fall of Shuri was not liberation, but another wound carved into their land. The human cost. By the time the Shuri line collapsed, American casualties were staggering, tens of thousands killed or wounded. Japanese losses were even greater, their divisions reduced to remnants, their hospitals overflowing with the dying. Civilians fared worst of all. Many were caught in the crossfire during the battles for Sugarloaf and Conical Hill. Others drowned in flooded caves where they had sought shelter. One Marine recalled stumbling upon a cave after a firefight. Inside, dozens of civilians lay dead men, women, children, some killed by artillery, others by their own hands, following Japanese propaganda that promised torture if they surrendered. It was, he said, the most terrible thing I've ever seen. And it wasn't even the enemy, it was the people we were supposed to be liberating. The meaning of Shuri. The fall of the Shuri line marked a turning point. The Americans had broken through the strongest defensive belt on Okinawa. The Japanese had retreated to their final redoubt at Kian, but the end was now only a matter of time. Still, the cost of victory gnawed at every soldier. The Shuri line had fulfilled its purpose. It had bled the Americans terribly, showing them what an invasion of Japan itself might cost. For every ridge, every bunker, every yard of ground, the Americans had paid in blood. And for every soldier lost, countless Okinawan civilians had suffered alongside them. The rain eventually ceased, but the memory of those weeks remained. Mud death and the smell of decay haunted survivors long after the guns fell silent. For many, Okinawa was not remembered as a triumph, but as a crucible, a place where victory was indistinguishable from tragedy. The Shuri line had collapsed, but Okinawa's agony was not over. The final act of the battle, fought in the southernmost reaches of the island, would prove even more merciless. By June 1945, Okinawa was a wasteland. Hills that once bore green sugarcane fields were cratered moonscapes. Villages that had stood for centuries were piles of charred rubble. The air reeked of decay, flies swarmed over unburied corpses, and the cries of the wounded echoed from caves. Yet the battle was not over. The shattered Japanese 32nd Army, reduced to fragments of its former strength, had withdrawn to the Kion Peninsula at Okinawa's southern tip. There, amidst cliffs and caves, the last defenders prepared to make their final stand. The last resistance. The Americans pressed relentlessly. On June 9th, the 10th Army launched its final offensive, advancing toward Kion through rain-soaked ravines and shattered villages. The Japanese, though starving and battered, fought with the same grim determination that had defined the entire campaign. Every cave was a bunker, every ridge a stronghold. Soldiers who had nothing left still clutched rifles with trembling hands, waiting to take one more enemy with them. By this stage, the 32nd Army was no longer an army at all. It was a collection of desperate remnants. Of the 100,000 men who had once manned the defenses, only a fraction remained. Many were wounded, many starving, many little more than walking ghosts. And yet, they refused to surrender. For civilians, the suffering grew even worse. Families hid in caves, starving disease spreading in the filth. Japanese officers urged them to kill themselves rather than fall into American hands, handing out grenades for family suicides. Entire groups leapt from cliffs into the sea, mothers clutching children as they plunged. To this day, Okinawan memory recalls those cliffs as places of unspeakable grief. The death of Buckner. On June 18th, tragedy struck the Americans. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., commander of the 10th Army, was observing his troops near the front lines when Japanese artillery opened fire. A fragment of shrapnel struck him in the chest, killing him almost instantly. Buckner was the highest-ranking American general to be killed in action during World War II. For his men, his death was a shock. He had led them through months of agony, steady and resolute, if not always imaginative. Now, at the cusp of victory, he fell to the same indiscriminate shellfire that had claimed so many of his soldiers. His successor, General Joseph Stilwell, would oversee the final phase of the battle, but Buckner's death was a reminder that no rank or reputation could shield a man from Okinawa's merciless grasp. The fall of the 32nd Army. On June 19th, American forces finally broke through the last organized Japanese defenses. The battle devolved into a hunt for survivors. Small groups of Japanese soldiers fought to the death in caves, sometimes ambushing patrols, sometimes charging suicidally from hiding. Others chose ritual suicide rather than capture. In a cave on the Kion Peninsula, General Ushijima gathered his staff. He knew the end had come. His army was annihilated, his men sacrificed, his island lost. Yet he remained calm, embodying the stoic dignity that had defined him throughout the campaign. Beside him, General Isamu Cho, the fiery chief of staff, who had once pushed for reckless offensives, drank heavily, writing poems and final letters as he prepared for the inevitable. On the night of June 21st, the two generals performed seppuku, the ritual suicide of the samurai. Ushijima bowed to his staff, thanked them for their service, and plunged the blade into his abdomen. Cho followed, shouting defiance to the last. Their aides completed the ritual, beheading them swiftly to end their suffering. In death, they joined the thousands of their men who had already perished. With their passing, the Battle of Okinawa was effectively over. Aftermath of a bloodbath. When the guns finally fell silent, the numbers told a grim story. The Americans had lost over 12,000 dead and more than 36,000 wounded. Thousands more were casualties of disease, exhaustion, and trauma. The Navy suffered terribly under kamikaze attacks. Nearly 5,000 sailors killed, 36 ships sunk, and over 300 damaged. The Japanese toll was catastrophic. Of the roughly 100,000 soldiers who had defended the island, nearly all were dead. Fewer than 7,500 surrendered, a minuscule fraction. The rest fought to the end or took their own lives. But the greatest tragedy was borne by the civilians of Okinawa. Estimates vary, but between 100,000 and 150,000 Okinawans, nearly a third of the island's population, died. Some were killed in bombardment, some in crossfire, some driven to suicide by Japanese propaganda. Families were torn apart, villages annihilated, a culture scarred for generations. For Okinawans, the battle was not remembered as liberation, but as devastation. Their island had been transformed into the bloodiest battlefield of the Pacific. Their people sacrificed in a war not of their choosing. The shadow of the bomb. For the Americans, victory at Okinawa was both triumph and warning. They had seized the last stepping stone to Japan, securing airfields and anchorages for the final assault on the home islands. Yet the cost was staggering. If Okinawa had demanded such a toll, what would an invasion of Kyushu or Honshu require? Hundreds of thousands of American dead, millions of Japanese. These questions haunted American leaders in Washington. The bloody lessons of Okinawa weighed heavily on the decision to use atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The battle had shown in brutal clarity that Japan would not surrender easily, that every inch of their homeland would be defended with fanaticism, and that the cost of invasion would be almost unimaginable. In this way, the oceans of blood spilled on Okinawa flowed directly into the rivers of fire unleashed by the atomic bomb. Legacy of the island for the survivors. American, Japanese, and Okinawan alike, the memory of Okinawa never faded. Veterans spoke of it with a mixture of pride and sorrow, their voices heavy with the weight of what they had seen. Sailors remembered the terror of kamikazes diving from the sky. Soldiers remembered the ridges where comrades fell and never rose again. Civilians remembered the caves where families died together, their whispers silenced forever. Shuri Castle, once the symbol of Okinawan kings, lay in ruins, its stones blackened by fire. The island itself seemed haunted, scarred by craters, its fields littered with rusting helmets, rifles, and bones. Yet, life endured. In time, Okinawa rebuilt. The fields grew green again, villages rose from rubble, children laughed once more. But beneath the soil lay the remains of 100,000 souls, silent witnesses to the cost of war. The Battle of Okinawa was an American victory, but it was victory purchased at a price so high it forced the world to pause. It was not just another battle, it was a reckoning. A reminder that even triumph can taste of ash, and that in war, there are no true winners, only survivors.